So good evening and welcome to this special Stevenson Trust for Citizenship lecture at the University of Glasgow. I'm Christopher Carman. I'm the Stevenson professor here at the university. Tonight, we're pleased to welcome back Professor Sir John Curtice to explain the recent general election, its result, and to discuss some of the implications for the future. The Stevenson Trust for Citizenship was founded in 1921 with a generous gift to the university by Sir Daniel Stevenson, who was a Glasgow philanthropist. He was council leader, and he was chancellor of this fine institution. Sir Daniel was particularly keen that the Stevenson Trust work to promote education and research in matters relating to citizenship, rather broadly defined on a local, national, and international scale. And few political processes highlight the role of citizens like the UK general election process. On the 22nd of May, Prime Minister Sunak announced the date of the election. Parliament was dissolved on the 30th of May. On the 4th of July, we had polling day. Over that night, we had the count and, of course, the announcement of the exit poll by Professor Sir John Curtice on the telly. And a bit after midday on the 5th of July, Sir Keir Starmer was invited to form the next government by the King. And that afternoon, both the then former Prime Minister and the new Prime Minister delivered speeches graciously acknowledging the result and recognizing the public service of the other. It's this exercise of democracy without a great deal of pomp and ceremony, which particularly relates to the role of citizens in accepting and supporting the processes that bring forward this elections at a breakneck speed in the UK. It can be a bit dizzying and difficult for us to keep up with. It can be a bit dizzying and difficult for psephologists called up to work at the last minute on exit polls. But fortunately, Professor Sir John Curtice is so willing to give us his time to come and explain the election result. As I mentioned in the previous introduction prior to the pre-election talk, that Sir John really is quite exceptional in giving up his time to come and support the Stevenson Trust on a regular basis with these lectures. And we are extremely grateful to him for that. Quickly, before I turn over to Sir John, I will note that, as usual, we are recording tonight's lecture, and we will make it available on our website. You can find that by Googling Stevenson Trust, University of Glasgow. We have archived lectures there, and we encourage anybody to take a look at those. We also, in recording, we take it that you consent to being included in that recording if you decide to ask a question during the Q&A. During the Q&A, we will prioritize questions in the room, but with the able assistance of Karen Wright, we'll also try to take questions from those attending on Zoom as well. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Sir John Curtice.
While Chris is fiddling there, thank you all for turning up. I always thought that Glasgow emptied out in July, but you're just the living proof that some people are still here. And I guess, given how miserable the weather has been this summer, you've decided that this might be at least slightly more entertaining than enjoying the Scottish countryside. But there we go. Thank you, Chris.
I'm just sharing your slides.
Brilliant.
All the joys of work. Right. That should be that.
There we go. Perfect.
And this should, yep, there you go.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. Okay. And would you like your speech? Because you're covering up my speech. Here we go. Brilliant. Fantastic. Right. Okay. So some of you heard the talk down on the other side of the hill during the election campaign. I'm not going to repeat virtually any of that, you'll be pleased to hear, but equally I'm not going to assume that you were there 2 or 3 weeks ago, or however long it was. What I'm going to do is, in a sense, take the leitmotif of the winning party, which was change, and to ask 5 questions about change, or 5 questions about ways in which the 2024 election did or did not transform British politics. I hope you will come away with at least some of your thoughts and expectations about the election having been changed, and certainly also with some idea of the fascinating range of questions that are raised by an election which in many respects is unique in post-war British politics. So my 5 questions is, so why did the Tory vote collapse? And the word collapse is the only word that can reasonably be used for looking at the position of the Conservative Party, both north and south of the border. Secondly, did Labour's vote actually change? Not only in terms of its level, but also in its character, and particularly with respect to some of the ambition that Sir Keir Starmer had for his party's vote when he became leader in 2020. Then, given the fracturing of the electorate, we now have more parties in the House of Commons than ever before. You know, what are some of the things that underlay that fracturing? Then inevitably, partly because this is the one area where we've got all the data we might want, whereas a lot of the questions about why people did what they did, we will be waiting for things like the Scottish election study, the British election study, British social attitudes, etc. You know, don't ask us before Christmas. But on the electoral system, we already have the data we need. So I will look quite a lot at how the electoral system operated, to what extent did it change, and to some degree, what are the implications for the debate about the future of that system. And then, of course, one could not give a debate, a talk in Scotland about the election without referring once more to the constitutional debate north of the border, and where does this or does not lead us, to what extent does this change the position with respect to that. Now, this, however, is one slide I did show 3 weeks ago, and I have to show it because, in a sense, if you want to understand why the Tory vote collapsed, you do actually have to look at the history of the 2019 to 2024 Parliament. So this is simply a running average of the opinion polls all the way through from January 2020. And there are 3 crucial things to note. The first is that the Conservative Party, believe it or not, was never, ever consistently behind the Labour Party in the opinion polls until December 2021, which was the month when the first stories about what we come to know as Partygate were first aired, both on ITV News and inside the Daily Mirror. And as you can see there, the Conservatives fell behind the Labour Party in the polls more or less instantly. Indeed, they more or less lost about 6 points in 6 weeks. So that's crucial event number 1. Crucial event number 2 is, of course, the Liz Truss fiscal event, a market crisis that was instigated by some of the ways in which they tried to pursue tax cuts. The Conservative Party fell to 25% in the opinion polls, and they ended up at 24% last Thursday, well, today, a week ago today. So in a sense, you know, the rest was all fluff. Couple of things to note thereafter. One is you will see that in the summer of last year, roughly around this, just before this time, support for the Conservative Party was actually recovering. And then the mistake they made was not to vote comprehensively, including the Prime Minister, the then Prime Minister, for the Privileges Committee report that said that Boris Johnson had indeed misled the House of Commons over Partygate. The Conservative Party did not understand that that was one thing they absolutely needed to disavow and separate themselves from, and the public started to fall away once again. The second thing to notice is the gradual increase of that little blue line at the bottom, the pale blue line, as opposed to the deep blue line. And that's reform. It began to rise in the wake of the Liz Truss fiscal event from around 3% to about 7%. But then it rose further, starting basically in around October, November of last year, from around 6-7% to around 11-12%. And that curiously coincided with around the time that the UK Labour government decided to make immigration one of the policy areas on which it decided to focus, to try to take action, and certainly to draw dividing lines between themselves and Labour. So clearly that's something we need to pursue a little further. But in a sense, if you want to understand why the Conservative Party lost as badly as it did, I have actually already said enough. I'll go a little further, but that is really the only graph you really need to see and understand. It is not, by the way, it is not anything significantly to do with Sunak's failure to attend the international part of the D-Day commemorations. It's nothing to do particularly with the betting row that went on during the campaign. The only thing that happened in the campaign that mattered, and it did matter to the Conservatives, was Nigel Farage's decision to intervene as leader. And you can see that after week 2, which is the end of which he intervened, support for reform starts going up, and it goes up a bit further. And that's the only thing that mattered. Actually, the decline in Conservative support actually bottomed out at roughly the same time that the story about the so-called betting scandal got back into the news for the second time round, when we discovered that rather more people were involved than just the Prime Minister's PPS. And actually then towards the end, the Conservative Party did begin to recover a little bit. So remember, a lot of the journalistic frippery and interest and hype, as is so often the case, proved to be largely irrelevant. I mean, the polls did shift. I mean, the Labour Party support fell, not only just the Conservative vote falling in the wake of reform, but it wasn't largely to do with most of those things. So anyway, so therefore, again, it's what happened before the campaign that matters primarily, not what happened during the campaign, if you want to understand the Conservatives' difficulties. Now, that said, we do need to look at the result. We need to look at the result because this is a result with two very, very different halves. Point one, yes, the Conservative vote did collapse. That 24% is by far and away the worst Conservative result in British electoral history, all the way back to 1832. Previous low was indeed 29% in 1832. The Conservatives have never, ever done this badly. It was a truly shocking result. And none of our biggest parties have ever managed to lose 20% in the course of 2 elections. But, and this is a big but, it was not the Labour Party what did it. The Labour vote barely increased on 2019. Indeed, I'll show you in a moment, it increased even less than even that slide actually suggests. So here's one caveat about did Labour's change. In terms of vote share, barely at all. Rather, the two parties that gained were one, Reform, who, as compared with the Brexit Party, were up by 12.5 points, and the Greens, who by far and away recorded a vote share for themselves. But then you will see the curiosity. The two parties that gained seats, overwhelmingly in both cases, were the two parties that did not increase their vote share. It really is a curious kind of election, right? And the two parties that gained most, they made a breakthrough in terms of parliamentary terms, but they gained relatively little. This clearly is going to be one of the things that we're talking about when we talk about electoral reform. Meanwhile, the SNP do fall back, and we'll say about more of that as we go on later on. The other remarkable thing about it is we have the election of, 6 independents across the UK as a whole. One of them is in Northern Ireland, so we've got 5 in Great Britain. That means we've now got more independent MPs than we've had at any time since the abolition of the university seats back in 1950. All right? So some people just went outside the party system entirely, although these independents may now decide to form a registered party. So it is a very curious result. So we do do need to dig deeper. Indeed, if we now also break it down according to the 3 nations in Great Britain, you will see even more how relatively anemic Labour's performance was. In England, where there are kind of no other factors to take into account. Their vote is literally just up by a half a point. This is a Labour Party that barely did any better than Jeremy Corbyn, did not in 2019, did not do as well as Jeremy Corbyn in 2017, and was doing nothing like as well as Tony Blair did in 1997, or indeed not even in 2005, when Tony Blair only got 36% of the vote in Great Britain. This is now the government with the smallest share of the vote that's been able to form a single party majority government. We have never had a government that has got acquired power on such a low share of the vote. Oh, and by the way, I didn't talk about it, also on a near record low turnout. So if you actually work out the proportion of the population that's actually voted for the government, it is astonishingly low. The other thing you will note about the Labour performance is that they fell back in Wales. Being in government was not a good place to be on the 4th of July. So the UK Conservative government loses out across the UK as a whole. The SNP lose out in Scotland. And the Labour Party, who of course are responsible for the devolved administration in Cardiff, also lose out in Wales. Everywhere, the electorate reacted against the incumbent government. And again, it's a kind of indication of the extent of the discontent and disenchantment that we have in our electorate at the moment. And it's directed at whoever happens to be sitting there and seemingly having some responsibility for the state of the country. The Conservatives don't collapse as much in Scotland as they do elsewhere. Simple, they don't have as many votes to lose. We'll come back to that. But it's still actually a record worst performance for the Conservatives in terms of a parliamentary election, Westminster election in Scotland. Reform don't advance as well, but they do advance quite noticeably north of the border. And meanwhile, again, the Greens up here don't make as much progress as their sister party south of the border. Okay. I should also say, but I'm not going to go into this, the opinion polls, again, didn't have a particularly happy time, at least so far as the regular polls are concerned in terms of estimating the result. These are the kinds of errors that we've kind of historically got used to, whereby they do tend to underestimate Labour. And overestimate Labour and underestimate the Conservatives. You might want to come back to the Q&A, but it will take a while to sort out what's going on. So, why did the Tories lose so many votes? Can I remind you, for those of you who are watching, that the first of the 7-way leader debates, and you'll remember that on one side of the stage, there was Angela Rayner and Penny Mordaunt. And they frankly wanted to hold a conversation is far too polite a word. They wished to have an argy-bargy with each other and largely ignore everybody else, including above all, Mr. Farage, who was standing very politely on the other side of the podium. Nothing to do with us. You can see how fundamental a mistake the Conservative Party were making. They thought they should not be talking about reform because they didn't want to give them credibility. The bird had already flown the nest. The bird had flown the nest when in the first 2 weeks of the election campaign, support for reform remained at 11%. That is probably one of the reasons why Farage decided to intervene, because it was already true by that stage that Reform were in a stronger position than the Brexit Party had been at the same stage in the 2019 election campaign. This vote was not being squeezed. And then Farage jumps on board. But basically, twice as many people at least who voted Conservative in 2019 switched to Reform rather than switch to Labour. The Conservative Party were never, ever going to make much progress in this election campaign unless they could squeeze the Reform Party vote. And they frankly made no progress on that during the election campaign at all. You will see there on the right-hand side, I'm saying YouGov and Ashcroft. Very helpfully, Lord Ashcroft has done a poll around last Thursday, and YouGov has done one since last Thursday, and both organisations did one in 2019 and in 2017, so it's great. It means we've got the first survey data, which enables us to do some comparison. So I'm therefore going to rely on those two surveys, not exclusively, but a fair amount for some of what I'm going to show. So the other way of looking at the impact of reform is to look at what was going on in the constituency. So what I'm now doing here is taking the constituencies and I'm breaking them up. On the left-hand side, are the ones where reform, as compared with the Brexit Party, advanced least. And on the right-hand side are the constituencies where they advance most. And you will notice that the better that reform do, the worse the Tories do. Right? The Tories are the party that lose out, whereas Labour actually do slightly better in places where reform go up. And it doesn't make any difference of any great note to the Liberal Democrats. So again, very, very clear that reform are the problem. And indeed, this does mean there is what is probably a deeply unpalatable truth that both Labour and the Democrats have to take on board, which is that they are where they are thanks to Mr. Farage. Without reform basically eroding the foundations of the Tory citadel, it is inconceivable that either Labour or the Democrats would have the level of seat tally that they have. There are other reasons to why where they are that I will come on to. But that erosion of the Conservative vote by reform is the foundation of their, one of their key foundations of their success. And both parties would be silly not to recognise that. Now, given I've said that, you may now be concluding, so I know what the Tories' problem was: immigration and Brexit, because these are the things that, above all, reform voters are concerned about. Those of you who were at my talk 3 weeks ago might go, but hang on, didn't he say something other about it was the economy and the NHS, and it wasn't really anything to do with immigration? And yes, you're right, I did. So let me elaborate a little bit further. I'm using data from the May wave, the May just gone, from the British election study, which very helpfully came out during the election campaign. And so what I'm doing here, I'm taking 2019 Conservative voters. I'm dividing them up according to their views about what had happened to the economy in the last 12 months, which is the best measure that I have available to do this analysis on the latest BES wave. So the folk on the far left-hand side up there, the 19%. So these are 2019 Conservative voters who in May said the economy has got a lot worse over the last 12 months. They're about 18% or so of Tory voters who take that view. Now, of that group, just 19% said that they would vote Conservative again. And for those of you interested that don't know, those are in the denominator here. On the right-hand side of that left-hand quartet are the people who said, oh, no, the economy is getting better. And 57% of them were willing to vote Conservative again. So you can see how important the economy is. I've already argued that Liz Truss and the fiscal crisis, the financial crisis of September, October 2022 was important. But you can then also see how in the relationship between people's perceptions of the economy and their willingness to vote Conservative again, that the economy proves to be important. Now, as you would expect, the people who think the economy is doing badly were more likely to vote Labour than were those who said that it wasn't. So transferring from Conservative to Labour is associated with perceptions of the economy. But so also is perceptions of the economy and the relation and your willingness to switch to reform. The slope is arguably not so great, but just notice that of those people who switched to Labour, 29% said the economy had got worse, but equally of those who switched to reform, 23% of them said that the economy had got worse. So the economy is a push factor away from the Conservatives that both reform voters and Labour voters share in common. It isn't just immigration. Now let's do the NHS. Again, you heard me talk before, said I think the Conservatives made a fundamental mistake in not dealing with this issue and not focusing on trying to get the waiting list down, as opposed to wasting their money on tax cuts. And this just elaborates on that. So again, amongst those who thought the NHS was getting a lot worse, only 25% of 2019 Tories were willing to vote for the party again. Amongst those who thought it was getting better, 66%. were willing to vote Conservative again. Again, people who are upset about the state of the health service who voted Tory in 2019 were more likely to vote Labour. But notice now how much also this issue matters to Reform voters. There's actually a big slope there. And actually, it's just over a half of people who switch to Labour who think the economy, the NHS is getting a lot worse. It's also just over a half of Reform voters who think that the NHS is getting worse. So these guys are not just being pushed away by immigration, and it's nothing to do with the economy and the NHS. Those people who switched to Reform were also being pushed away by the economy and by the NHS. So what do we find if we now do the same analysis on immigration? Now, this is not my preferred data set. It's not my preferred question. But curiously, the British election study did not ask about immigration. I've used it for previous things. I get similar results. So I think this is reasonably correct. Now, you will notice there is a sort of bit of a slope on the left-hand side. So these are the 2019 Tory voters. And if you thought that Brexit had failed to reduce immigration, you were a bit less likely to say you're going to vote Conservative than if you didn't take that view. But as compared with the two previous slides I've shown you, that relationship is relatively weak. What you will now also see, however, is that the Conservative voters, Labour voters, doesn't make any difference as to whether you go to Labour or not. It does make a difference, however, as to whether you go to Reform. Right? So the focus switch to Reform are indeed the ones who are more likely to be concerned about the perception that Brexit has failed to reduce immigration. So the way, therefore, I think we have to think about it is this. And this, in truth, is part of the broader story of this election. This is, in broad terms, an election that the Conservatives lost. And voters were not too fussy about who they voted for instead. It was whoever they thought either could express their views or could ensure that the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, was going to lose locally. So I think the way to think of it here and specifically is basically if you were a 2019 Conservative voter who was upset about the state of the economy, blamed Liz Truss, upset about the NHS, and probably also upset about Boris Johnson, and you were then also concerned about immigration and about Brexit, you went to Reform. But if you had those same concerns about the Tory party, but maybe you changed your mind about Brexit, or you were less concerned about immigration, you switched to Labour. In other words, immigration and Brexit structure the destination of 2019 Tory voters who defect, but it's not necessarily the original cause of their defection. And to that extent, at least, therefore, the Conservatives, if they wanted to deal with Reform, should have again focused on the NHS, not on tax cuts, which was never going to go anywhere with this constituency, and they might have had more success in dealing with them. Okay, so let's now look at the other side of the political spectrum. I'm going to use very loosely the term progressive to refer to Labour, the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, because one of the other leitmotifs this election is that sometimes you have to look at Conservative and Reform together and Labour, the Liberal Democrats and the Greens together in order to understand what's going on, and particularly to understand some of the structure of the way in which demographically we have now divided as a society. So the first line just is to say, no, there weren't very many 2019 Labour or Liberal Democrat or Green voters switching to either the Conservatives or to Reform. It was overwhelmingly 2019 Conservative voters. There was, however, quite a lot of interchange between the Liberal Democrats and the Labour Party, between the Greens and the Labour Party, indeed between the Greens and the Liberal Democrats. But also there was movement in the opposite direction. There were some Labour voters who switched to the Liberal Democrats and some of them who switched to the Greens. So that is arguably worth pursuing a little further as we now move on from why did the Tories do so badly to so how did Labour's vote change? Now, one of the things that Keir Starmer aimed to do with his, I'm not going to talk about Brexit, and I'm always going to make sure there's a Union Jack behind me whenever I stand in front of a camera, and I'm not going to say anything too liberal about transgender people, et cetera, that kind of rather more socially conservative appeal was to try and change his party's vote and to reconnect with Leave voters. Well, here's the first piece of evidence that perhaps Keir Starmer's strategy did not come without downsides. Because in much the same way as that pesky Reform Party nibbled at the Conservative vote, or rather took rather large chunks out of it, the Greens also began to nibble at the Labour vote. As you can see here, now what I'm doing is I'm taking constituencies and I'm dividing them up according to how much the Green vote advanced on 2019. And what you will see is that where the Greens advance least, Labour do particularly well. That will be partly to do with England, but Scotland, but it's not only to do with Scotland. And you will notice that where the Greens went up most, the Labour Party did least well. And the Conservative Party does better in these constituencies as well. So the Greens start to nibble away. Hang on to that. The other thing that Keir Starmer was trying to do was to reconnect with the traditional working class Labour vote. He's looking to try to restore the Labour Party back to the pre-Corbyn position, whereby at least was somewhat stronger amongst working class voters than amongst middle class voters. Nothing doing. Nothing has changed. We are still looking at a Labour Party where the relationship between class and vote looks exactly like it did under Jeremy Corbyn and not like it did under Tony Blair, let alone what it looked like under Harold Wilson. This is still a party that is whose support is evenly spread across the spectrum. The same, by the way, is still largely speaking true of the Conservatives, although they do lose somewhat more ground amongst those in the C2DE, more working class groups. And that is partly because that's where Reform are going up most. Yes, the prize for the party whose vote is most strongly concentrated in the working class. It doesn't have most working class votes, but the character of its vote is the most working class, is Reform. And the Democrats still just about claim the prize for having the most middle class vote. It's only just, it's not very strong, but it is still there. But again, it does therefore mean that if you really want to understand the relationship between demography and vote, if you put Conservative and Reform together, then you can see how the right, loosely speaking, in the UK is more popular amongst the working class than it is amongst those in the middle class, and that to some degree at least, the opposite is true amongst those who I'm loosely calling the progressives. What has been the biggest demographic divide in our politics prior to 2024 is age. And it does still matter. But here in particular, you really do now have to think in terms of blocks rather than in terms of individual parties. So you will see the Conservative vote almost inevitably falls more amongst those who are somewhat older, because there are more of them there. And indeed, I mean, the Conservative Party has now pretty much hit rock bottom amongst that section of our electorate that many of whom did not vote in 2019 because they were too young. 8% is as bad as it can possibly get. But beyond that, you will notice that as well as the Conservative Party still, particularly amongst the 65 pluses, being relatively strong, Reform is also stronger amongst older voters. So you put the two things together and you still have a very strongly demarcated vote, very strongly demarcated by age. Then notice what happens to 18, 24-year-olds on the progressive side. And it's there both in Ashcroft and in YouGov, almost identical figures, which is why I've just been able to average the two. The Labour Party is much less popular amongst 18 to 24, today's 18 to 24-year-olds than they were in the 18 to 24-year-olds of 5 years ago. And the party that's done the damage, yes, it is the Greens. Now, this is going to be a hypothesis to pursue rather than something that one could prove at the moment, but given also some of the work that the National Centre was doing with British Social Attitudes during the election, hypothesis is that in moving to a more socially conservative direction, the Labour Party has lost some of the young, urban, progressive, socially liberal vote that Corbyn managed to gather onto the party. Doesn't mean to say that Labour's strategy is wrong, but it does say it came with costs. and that this is certainly perhaps the most striking thing. The other thing, of course, the Labour Party was trying to do was to appeal, relatively speaking, more strongly to those who voted leave, with which it had a measure of success. This is breaking it down by 2016 vote, which is now getting very ancient, but it's both what Ashcroft and YouGov did. So the Labour vote is down by 3 points amongst those who voted Remain. It's up by 4 points amongst those who voted Leave. So it's a bit more of a pro-Leave vote. Notice the collapse, the utter collapse of the Johnsonian Leave coalition. Right, it's just dramatic. That group of people that were brought into the Conservative Party to vote for it, it just gone. I mean, it's still just true that the decline in Conservative support since 2015 is rather greater amongst Remain voters and Leave voters. We're not quite back to the voting structure of the vote in 2015, but almost. But you can also see it's the Reform Party what does it. It is not the Labour Party what's doing that damage amongst that group. And then, you know, the Liberal Democrats also lose ground amongst Remain voters and gain it amongst Leave voters. But that's really not the way you should do it anymore. What we should be doing is looking at with respect to people's current attitudes towards Brexit, because a fair proportion of people have changed their views, and the balance between rejoin and stay out is around 56 to 58% wanting to rejoin, 42 to 44% wanting to stay out. So it's rather different from what it was in 2019, let alone 2016. Now, if you do that, it's a similar picture for Labour. But in this case, now you say, well, their vote's gone up in both groups. It's gone up more amongst the group that would vote to stay out. But remember, this is the smaller of the two groups. So how much it impact has on Labour's composition, we'll see at the moment. Do it this way, and the decline in the Conservative Leave coalition is even more dramatic, because whereas 80% of people who believed in Leave back in 2019 voted for the Conservatives, it is now down to 32%. And again, it is Reform that primarily picks these voters up. Indeed, if you now take these data and turn them around and say what proportion of Labour's vote was coming from people who support the EU, it's not quite as high as it was in 2019, but it's still pretty high. This is a government that has been elected, despite the party's official policy, by a vast majority of people who would prefer to be inside the European Union. So you can see that there are a number of ways in which Labour have not changed their vote in the way that they were hoping to do. Indeed, we can also show this through electoral geography. This is the change in party support by the level of support for Leave in a constituency back in 2016. Left-hand side are the most pro-Remain constituencies, the right-hand side the most pro-Leave. Again, you can see the Conservative vote is falling most heavily in the Leave parts of the country. Labour is doing somewhat better amongst the constituencies that voted most heavily for Leave, but it's not that dramatic. But then also notice something else. Notice what happens if we add to the Conservative vote, and the change in the Conservative vote in the constituency, the change in the Reform vote. That's what the grey bars show you. And once you put the two together, there's no change in our geography, right? So the loss of Conservative votes in Leave areas is basically being compensated for by the rise of Reform support in those areas. Equally, notice what happens if we now follow, what are they, yellow or orange, it depends. They're somewhere in between the two, but the right-hand side of each quartet, right? This is what you now get if you put Labour together with the Liberal Democrats and the Greens. And you now see that the heights of the bars are almost identical. So equally, the geography of Brexit, once you think in terms of blocks rather than in terms of individual parties, is again largely unchanged. It does therefore mean that if you look at Conservative and Labour alone, for the most part, apart from the most remaining parts of the country, like around here, then basically the level of Conservative and Labour support is relatively invariant with what happened to the Leave referendum locally back in 2016 but and indeed, the change in their support since 2015, it looks pretty similar. It looks as though the geography is completely washed out. But if you now think in terms of blocks and follow the grey bars for the parties of the right, as we move from the most remain areas to the most leave areas, the vote goes up. And if we again think of the progressive section, as we go from left to right, the yellow bars become less tall. So the geography of Brexit may no longer be articulated by Conservative and Labour, but it is being articulated by the parties to the right and to their left is probably wrong for the Democrats, but those who are also occupying the same ideological space. So Conservative and Labour has, to some extent, exited the geography of Brexit, but that doesn't mean to say the geography of Brexit has exited the electorate. It can still seem to be there. So Labour have in many ways, therefore, not changed in the way that Keir Starmer was wanting to claim with his suggestion that it's his ability to change the Labour Party that is the fundamental foundation of his party's success. It's much easier to argue that it's to do with the problems of the Conservative Party. Now, all of that said, some of you probably remember a lot of people saying during the last 5 years, nah, Labour Party can't possibly win an overall majority. The electoral geography is against them. They need a 14-point lead to get an overall majority. And this is what you got if you said, let's assume that the third party vote doesn't change, and we assume that support for the parties go up or down by the same amount everywhere, which of course they didn't. And indeed, the Labour Party has managed to get an overall majority, a very large overall majority, with a lead of 11, which this says you wouldn't get. So clearly the geography must have shifted. So how is it that the electoral system played out as it did? Exhibit number 1. The Conservative vote fell more heavily in places where they were previously strongest. This was long on the cards. It was there in the English local elections of 2023, let alone the English local elections at the beginning of May, as well as being in all the megapolls. The megapolls were, in any sense, entirely accurate in terms of seats, but the underlying story they told was absolutely spot on. It was very helpful for those of us who were doing the exit poll. Now, what this therefore means is that the Conservative vote has just got geographically much more evenly spread, all right? And they're now second by a fair way. We all know from the experience of the SNP what happens to parties that come second with a geographically evenly spread vote. They lose out from the electoral system. And the Conservative Party now finds itself in a rather similar position to the Liberal Democrats historically, and also the SNP historically. He who lives by the sword can also die by the sword. To that was also then added very clear evidence of anti-conservative tactical voting. So what I'm now doing is dividing the constituencies up between, on the left-hand side, those where Labour were the challengers to the Conservatives locally, those where the Democrats were the challengers to the Conservatives locally, and then all other combinations are on the right-hand side, which are mostly Labour-held seats. And as you can see, basically the only places where the Labour vote systematically increased were constituencies where they were starting off in second place. Great, this is precisely what you want to do. Equally, the only places where the Democrats were consistently increasing their vote were in places where they were starting off second to the Conservatives. And you can see that, the Liberal Democrats were certainly doing a lot worse elsewhere, as were Labour, particularly in those other seats. So the problems for the Conservatives, therefore, were compounded because their principal opponent locally was doing better. This, again, is an indication of an electorate that was primarily determined to get rid of the incumbent government, and they weren't too fussy or too concerned about who else they voted for, perhaps because not least, they were not necessarily particularly enthused about any of the alternatives they had before them. Any stick would do to beat this particular government. It does therefore mean that the character of Labour's change in Labour support is exactly what, well, I'm not sure it's exactly what the party was intended, because I don't think they really intended to lose so many votes in seats that they already held. But you can see that where did their vote go up? It went up above all, right in the middle of the distribution, in places where they previously had 25 to 35% of the vote. If you add 10 to that, it means they're now getting 35 to 45% of the vote. And that's usually, particularly given how fractured this election was going to be enough to deliver you victory. So this proves to be very effective. But why this big drop on the right-hand side? Well, in part it's to do with Wales, but it's also to do with what happened to the Labour vote in constituencies with large number of Muslims. There is no other word that is apt for it, but that the Labour vote collapsed in constituencies with large numbers of Muslims on just a grander scale as the Conservative vote fell across the country as a whole. Who profited from this? Well, it wasn't the Conservative Party particularly, although there were a couple of constituencies with a substantial Hindu population where the Conservatives did actually do rather well, note. But otherwise, it was those independents standing on a pro-Gaza platform that were advancing together with George Galloway's Workers' Party. So, and obviously, again, one can argue this is a game compounded clearly by events, but insofar as Keir Starmer made anti-Semitism one of the things he constantly shouted about as one of the ways in which he changed the Labour Party, that together with a rather unfortunate interview on LBC, clearly then proved to have its downside. So here again is another example of how changing the Labour Party had its downsides as well as its potential upsides. One of the things that's been remarked in the wake of this is that therefore the focus on parties winning seats where they're coming off in second place is, does this mean we have a lot more constituencies where the now new incumbent MP is going to be constantly looking over their shoulder because, hang on, I don't have that big a majority. And to some extent, that is true. Though perhaps not so much as some of the commentary has suggested. This is just literally all the seats where the majority was less than 10%. So at 217, it is more than it has been at any recent election. Though so far as the government is concerned, basically because its lead over its opponent is so much greater, even if its own share is not that great, the percentage of government seats that are marginal is not actually quite on the scale that it was in 2010. But there is another way of looking at marginal seats, which perhaps is more indicative. And it takes us back to the fact that the Conservative vote fell more strongly in places where they're previously strongest. Labour goes up most in the middle of its distribution. So one of the things you can then, so basically therefore, both the Labour and the Conservative vote are more evenly distributed, which is great if you're first, not so good if you're second. And this is an illustration of this. This is, I won't go too much into the detail, but this is using a definition of seats that are marginal between Conservative and Labour. But it's only ones that are marginal between Conservative and Labour, where you basically control for the fact that at any particular election, one party or the other is more popular. So I basically recalibrate the electoral geography back to being 50-50 for that election. So these are the seats that would be marginal given the electoral geography of that election if the two parties were evenly divided between them. And it's just looking at Conservative Labour marginals. And what you will notice is that we're back to numbers of seats that are marginal between Conservative and Labour on a scale not seen since the beginning of this century. And in particular, once you take it as a percentage of the seats which are Conservative or Labour won, it's as high as it has been for some time. Now, this is another way of saying that because the distribution of the both parties' votes has become more evenly spread, the electoral system is now more likely to exaggerate the lead of Labour over the Conservatives or Conservative over Labour. And to that extent, at least, it's gotten back to being rather more effective as a way of enabling electorates to turf one government out and put another government in. However, there are other ways in which this electoral system is not working as it's meant to. Now, for those who are advocates of proportional representation, this will be the most horrendous graph of the evening. This is a measure of the disproportionality of recent elections all the way back to February 1974, which is the first election where the Liberal Party fought more or less every constituency and became a nationwide party again. It doesn't matter which index you use, and being academics, there are more indices than there are elections to try to work out with these things. But it doesn't matter what index you use. By any index, this is by far and away the most disproportionate election in British psephological history. So that's going to raise the debate about electoral reform. But here are two other ways in which the system is no longer working. The system is meant to discourage voters from voting for smaller parties. There's meant to be so strong a disincentive, you don't do it. The proportion of the vote that was won by Conservative and Labour combined was at this election lower than in any election since and including 1922, which is the first election in which the Labour Party became the principal opponents to the Conservative Party. The system is no longer keeping voters from voting for third parties, and it is also not keeping third parties out of the House of Commons. For the first time since 1923, we now have more than 100 MPs who were elected under labels other than Conservative and Labour, despite the decline in SNP representation. The fact that the Democrats have got their highest number since 1923, together with what's left of the SNP, but Reform, the Independents, the Greens, etc., we have a more fractured House of Commons, or to use the technical language, the effective number of parties, both in terms of voters and in terms of parliamentary parties, is higher than it has been since the 1920s. So these are ways in which the electoral system is not working as it should do, which of course leads to another piece of fun. Let's redo the calculation I did for Labour for 2019, and now let's redo the same calculation for the Conservatives, given the current electoral geography. There are 2 points to note. The first is that the system is not just exaggerating evenly or impartially the lead that Labour have over the Conservatives. The system is now also biased towards Labour, in much the same as it was biased towards the Conservatives in 2019. Notice, for example, that if the two parties were to get the same share of the vote, the Labour Party would end up with nearly 100 more seats than the Conservatives. Labour needs only a 1-point lead to hang on to their majority. The Conservatives need an 11-point lead in order to get a majority themselves. These are numbers not dissimilar to what we were saying after 2019, which also means, despite the increase in the exaggerative quality of the electoral system, i.e. its ability to exaggerate the lead of the first party over the second party, because we have so many third-party MPs, the range of results that can produce a hung parliament is still very substantial. Hung parliaments are not necessarily off the cards, which I'm sure is something the SNP are hoping is true, given that's the only way they'll ever manage to engineer a referendum anytime soon, which takes me to Scotland. And what I'm going to say about Scotland is fairly short and fairly brief, and you're probably glad to hear that because it's nearly 7 o'clock. And that's because, basically, I don't think the election has fundamentally changed anything north of the border. That is, the outcome, this is one place where the polls more or less got it right, despite a rather dodgy Savanta poll right at the end. If you take the average of the last poll done by all the polling companies and compare it with the result, they're all within 1 point. So the election confirms what we already knew, which is the SNP is in considerable political trouble. But that political trouble is no greater than we thought it was on the 22nd of May, because they were already at that position on the 22nd of May. They were in that position the moment that Humza Yousaf turfed out the Greens and caused political turmoil. Now, that's not to deny that the loss of Westminster seats loses the SNP opportunity, it loses them a source of finance, etc., etc. But it simply confirms what we already knew about the SNP's political difficulties. And so again, the electoral system exaggerates what's happened, because we thought with around 30%, they might get 12, somewhere between 12 and 18 seats. Why don't they? Well, it's a similar tale, right? Their vote goes down most heavily in the constituencies they're trying to defend. Therefore, they lose rather more than would otherwise be the case. And what also seems to have happened is that some Conservative voters in constituencies where the Conservatives were previously second, cottoned on to the fact that maybe their favoured party really wasn't going to win the election, this constituency this time, but maybe Labour would. And it looks as though some of them switched towards Labour in order to beat the SNP. In other words, the SNP have probably got the same problem as the Conservative Party, losing votes more heavily in places where you're previously strongest, and some of your opponents ganging up onto you. Again, the public are wanting to throw the rascals out, and they will use whatever instrument is available to them. So north of the border, the Labour Party are the instrument of choice in a way that they're not necessarily the instrument of choice elsewhere. And meanwhile, Liberal Democrats, who otherwise are doing absolutely nothing north of the border, but in the constituencies where they're fighting it out with the Tories, together with a completely sui generis ward in Inverness, which of course we have to wait until Saturday morning for, they managed to do brilliantly well in 6 constituencies, nothing else. But again, that also it was bad news for both the Conservatives and the SNP. But we just have to remember that on the constitutional question, this country is still divided absolutely down the middle. And the question will be whether or not the SNP can get back by 2026 the folk who say that they would vote for independence, but are not minded to vote for the SNP. And a lot of that, as does much of the rest of this talk, really does rest on how well this UK Labour government does. It's inherited a terribly difficult situation. There is a lively debate about whether or not some of the decisions it's made in advance of the election have or have not made its position more difficult or not. Time will tell, but certainly we cannot necessarily assume that by 2026, voting Labour will necessarily be the way in which you express your discontent with the way in which the country is being governed. Who knows? Maybe they will do well. Anyway, I'm not going to read all these out. I'm just going to quickly flick through these as you think of some difficult questions to ask. But I'm just going to put up a quick summary of what I said. That was the story for the Conservatives. That was the story for Labour. This was an election that the Tories lost, not one that Labour won. And Labour's vote has not fundamentally changed in terms of level or character. The fracturing means that you now need to think in terms of blocks rather than just in terms of parties in order to understand both the demography and the ideological breakdown of party support. The electoral system just went completely wild, okay, but has just had a fundamental impact on the outcome. And it is going to lead to a very substantial debate. But of course, it's a debate that probably the Labour Party, officially as it is in favour of proportional representation, somehow will have so little interest in. But some of us are old enough to remember that in the 1970s and the 1980s, until 1982 at least, there was quite a lively debate inside the Conservative Party about changing the electoral system. Look forward to the past being recreated inside the Conservative Party. And as I said, on Scotland, I'm not sure much has changed other than, we know the SNP is in trouble. They are in trouble. They've now suffered some of the consequences of their trouble, but whether or not the consequences are going to be the same in 2026 is still an open question. Le Fan.
Just a few things in that presentation to mull over, I suspect, for all of us. Once we get set up here, John, you mentioned turnout briefly.
Yeah.
So 2001, it was 59%.
Yeah.
And that caused a massive freak out.
Yeah.
We all started wondering about what do we do? Turnout's collapsing.
Yeah.
And then it sort of worked its way back up slowly.
Yeah.
We basically are back at that sort of same position now.
Yeah.
Do we have a big freak out over people not turning out? Is it something particular to this election? Or does it speak to, as you were saying, the electoral system being problematic, the seat vote discrepancy, which I guess people didn't know about.
No, I didn't know about,
But,
no.
but, we know that, people's support for democracy and on various measures is going down.
Yeah.
So what's
the story? Well, part of the story. So, I mean, I should say, first of all, Chris, this is one of those subjects where, some of us now know what some of the papers we're going to write in the next 6 to 12 months, because, once we get some of the survey data, it enables us to pursue this further. But we certainly thought there would be a low turnout. We certainly ran the exit poll on the expectation there would be about a 59% turnout, because it affects how you, certain aspects of how you conduct the polling exercise. So there are two things that are in common with 2001. The first is that the polls were saying it was all over by the shouting. And two, the two principal protagonists were pretty close to each other ideologically. So the Labour Party moving towards the centre, all right, as was true under New Labour, it depresses the incentive to turn out and vote, because what's the point? Because it ain't going to make any difference, right? To which we can then add two other factors. One is I mean, none of our principal party leaders are very good politicians, right? Neither Rishi Sunak nor Sir Keir Starmer. And I mean, Ed Davey in the end did quite well. I mean, at least he made a splash, and he he managed to attract some attention, but even so, I mean, the crucial thing that was missing for all these parties, and it was also true for the, John Swinney is a brilliant deputy, but whether he's ever going to make himself a leader is another matter, right? And the thing that was completely missing from this election campaign was, from any of the parties, was a synoptic message of, this is the kind of country we want to create, and then to have a set of policies that underpin that synoptic message. One of the really striking characteristics of Rishi Sunak's tenure as Prime Minister is it was initiative after initiative after initiative, some of them self-contradictory. Ironically, Sunak was Corbynite in the style of his campaigning, right? This was one of the mistakes the Corbynites made. So in 2019, if you looked at the people's attitudes towards the individual policies that Corbyn came up with, yeah, nationalise the railways, yes, my God, the trains are absolutely hopeless, et cetera, et cetera. But there was no overall arching message. I remember asking Annalise Dodds on the radio program, so Annalise, what's the Labour Party's broad message? Oh, to improve public services. And at the moment I went, you just haven't got it, have you, right? So Sunak, very episodic, but Starmer, I mean, I give you a funny story. I mean, I was doing one of these gigs in London doing the election campaign, and even a well-known political editor could not remember how many missions the Labour Party had, right? Because again, there's no, I mean, Labour Party's strapline was change. And basically what they wanted to talk about was the past. Well, from their point of view, it made sense because I've just explained why it made sense. But it therefore means that nobody has the foggiest idea at all. And there is very, very little in their manifesto about how they're going to actually change the country. So the point is that, point about get Brexit done, right? There's a strapline. This is what we want to do. But then underneath it was a whole set of policies, including domestic policies, that were designed to show you how getting Brexit done would then, from the perspective of the authors, improve Britain. That was what was entirely missing. And the problem is, Sunak is a details person, right? Or as one person unkindly put it to me, he's a manager, not a leader, right? But, he has the same qualities as Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown's problem as the Prime Minister is he got too involved in the detail. Rishi Sunak's problem as Prime Minister is he got too involved in the detail because he loves looking at a spreadsheet. So he can look at the spreadsheet, but he can't think strategically, right? And equally, Starmer, you don't want to be on the other side of him if you're in a debate, sure not, because he'll fillet your argument brilliantly. But the problem with prosecution lawyers is they've learned how to attack other people's arguments. They haven't learned to construct their own. And I'm not sure that Starmer has that broad strategic ability. Now, we'll wait and see how he does as Prime Minister, but he's certainly made a little effort to do it as an opposition leader. And, and that, more broadly, just being able to think politically about the direction in which you're trying to take your trying to take the country is just completely missing. So that's missing, to which you then add the little bombshell that British social attitudes threw into the middle of the election campaign, which Starmer has picked up, which is low levels of trust in politicians, low levels of confidence in the way in which we're being governed. It's a deeply disenchanted electorate. Again, a lot of the opinion polls were saying, yeah, these policies are great. Will they get done? Nah, they won't do it. They won't do it. So there's that deep sense of distrust about the political class, given the doubts about integrity, given the doubts about delivery. Now, if Labour can restore that, then they may have some success. But that's the fundamental challenge that we face. And until that's, to that, because there is the long-term thing. We do now have to give the electorate more of a reason to turn out and vote. Right. So what they are offered matters more than it once did. So all of that is true, but they weren't offered much in this election.
So we have the uninspiring leaders. We have, a lot of us were on holiday. And we have this sort of bizarre situation, but then on the other hand, we have the declining distrust.
Yeah, we basically have an election whose outcome is clear. It's not going to make much difference, seemingly, to how the country is going to be governed. We have leaders that do not enthuse or inspire, and we are pretty distrustful of what's going on. And yes, unless you give us a reason to vote, we're going to find something else to do. That's the toxic mixture you've got. So, but the point is, you shouldn't just be looking at the voters. You should be looking at the supply side, and the supply side was very weak in this election.
Right. They don't want to hear us talk all afternoon. Right. So we can open it up to questions. If you put your hands up, we'll go around. Wait, there's the first hand up, shot up over here immediately. So we'll head over this way. And in the meantime, I'm going to turn off these screens so we can look online and see without distracting.
Hello. Do you see reform as a permanent fixture in British politics, or if the Tories sort themselves out, will their significance fade?
The answer is they might be. Certainly one thing to watch is whether or not they do now start to create a proper party organization across the country. Farage says that's his ambition. I don't think he's the person to deliver it, but maybe Richard Tice will be, because at the moment they're a limited company. And they had a lot of paper candidates, although one of their paper candidates managed to get elected because he and his mum went around and did some canvassing and apparently seemed to be rather successful. But anyway, that was the guy in Basildon South. But they don't have that. And then they've got to sort out how they run themselves internally, because if you're going to have activists, you've got to give them reason to be activists, and that means you've got to have a degree of internal party democracy, etc., etc. So we have to watch the extent to which, and one of the fundamental weaknesses of the Eurosceptic movement in this country has been the failure to create a permanent party organization that has managed to endure. So that's one thing to look out for. Beyond that, it depends on how the other players in the game. We've in a sense, it's like somebody shuffled the pack, and their cards have been laid on the table, and we have a very, very unusual game, not a game that anybody is familiar with. Okay, so it now depends on how the players play the game. Now, reform's ideal world will be, one, the Conservative Party engages in fratricidal strife, with perhaps under a Tom Tugendhat leadership. So you've got a centre-left leader of the Conservative Party, but who doesn't manage to keep the party together. And meanwhile, the UK Labour government fails to deliver in terms of the economy, in terms of the NHS, etc., etc. Those are the circumstances the reform will be hoping to exploit. He will be hoping to take votes off Labour on the grounds of disenchantment. He will be hoping to take votes off, more votes off the Conservatives. There will be competition for that game, because the other potential player in this scenario will be the Liberal Democrats. But the Democrats now have to work out a strategy which has been so far entirely focused on criticizing the Conservatives. They've got to think about repositioning themselves so that they can profit from whatever misfortune befalls the UK Labour government. And not least the reasons why they have to do that is that if the Conservative Party ever recovers its electoral support, it will find it's got an awful lot of MPs who are up the creek without a paddle, because the party has failed to increase its overall vote share. So therefore, they basically are where they are, apart from the tactical voting, because of the collapse of the Conservative vote. If that begins to be restored, a lot of their MPs become vulnerable. So they've now got to think about ways of regaining gaining voters off the Labour Party. So this is all that none of us knows how well the actors will play the game, let alone what's going to happen in the real world. All we know is that there is now a different set of opportunities and constraints that the parties have to work through. And that in particular, virtually all of our parties now need to realize that they're no longer playing a two-party game. They're playing a multi-party game. And that is a different kind of game from the game that a lot of our politicians have traditionally been used to. So they may not play it very well.
Do you have any sense of how men and women voted in this election, if there's any significant differences, especially looking at younger vote?
The short answer is there isn't.
No.
Men were somewhat more likely to vote for reform, but there wasn't a great deal of difference, certainly in the Ashcroft and YouGov polling.
Connor, you want to come down this way?
You were mentioning reform, and obviously it's the smaller parties that want to have PR, and you're kind of alluding to the fact that probably we're not going to see PR coming along soon because it doesn't suit Labour. Do you think at the moment? Do you think they might get some seats in the Scottish election reform, or do you think?
Yeah, well, if they could maintain the level of support that they had north of the border in the Westminster election, then they could get through via the list system. Yeah, absolutely. Question is, how popular will they be in 2026? It's about what is it, about 7% in Scotland, if I remember rightly.
6.5.
6.5. So they're about, so basically to get on through the list system, you've got to get about 5.6% of the vote. Usually that will be enough. 6% will almost certainly be enough, unless you've got very obscure circumstances. So at 6.5, they may not get a seat in every region, but they should be starting to pick up seats. Yeah, they could.
But we certainly saw that in a few constituencies in Scotland. Again, reform made that difference between Labour and Conservatives.
Sure.
Douglas Ross's seat is.
Yeah, sure. No, absolutely. Yeah, no. The reform did well enough north of the border again to make life difficult for the Conservatives. Yeah, absolutely.
Karen, is there anything from the online questions?
Yeah.
And then
I'll just offer a couple of questions coming in online. The first is from Shell, who asks, was Gaza a significant reason for young people choosing to vote Green rather than Labour? And
Answer is ask us at Christmas, by which time we might have the data that's available.
Great.
I wouldn't be surprised if that's part of the mixture, but I've also suggested that perhaps it's also more broadly about the ability of the Greens to attract a relatively socially liberal young electorate. But we'll wait and see what are the things that really drive it.
Okay. Now, on the other side of the groupings that you were discussing, George English asks, what would have been the result if Conservative and Reform had managed to stay together as one bloc?
I mean, that's just so inconceivable in terms of what's happened. So, I mean, the problem, I mean, if you take the view as I do, that basically the Conservatives' problem is integrity and competence, I don't think even Nigel Farage could have wiped that away. I mean, it does mean there is a broader point, by the way, about all of this, which is at the end of the day, and this is going to be one of the real tensions inside the Conservative Party. I mean, you can see, as is the case, so many politicians go, the party didn't follow my preferred strategy, therefore that's the reason why we lost, right? And you can see the debate going on. But actually, the thing that if the Tories wish to get back into the electorate's eyes sooner rather than later, the thing that they're going to have to do with their next leader is to disavow Johnson and disavow Truss. they're basically going to have to admit that both of them made fundamental mistakes. And the question is whether any leader will have the ability to do so, given the somewhat different views of Tory activists on this question. But unless, I mean, in other words, basically the next Tory leader needs to do a Starmer on Corbyn, right? He needs to fundamentally distance his party from that history, because that is the history that is just hanging around the Conservative Party's neck.
So come to another question here, but can you say just a little bit, you said we don't have the data yet in response to one of Karen's question. I think, I know what you mean, but I think maybe it might,
well,
a little bit of
okay.
explanation.
So I mean, academics spend their time waiting after elections for survey data about individuals, and where we can ask people about their attitudes towards Gaza, and and we will know what they did in the 2019 election. We will know what they did in 2024. So we can start. I mean, some of the kind of analysis I did about a loss of Conservative support, right? Using survey data to look at patterns of association in order to try to identify why people lose support. And we have basically three key sources academically. One is a British election study standard survey where you go to a fresh sample of people and you interview them face to face. The second, there's a long now running panel run by the British Study over the internet, which has very large numbers of people in it. And that hopefully will ask the right questions, but I have no control over that. Chris can explain what's going on in Scotland because he's responsible for that. And then the British Social Action Survey, which I do have some responsibility for, is certainly going to include on the 2024 survey. Well, we both have a panel survey that's in the field now, and we will also have another survey that again, another British Social Action Survey that again will ask questions because of the election, that again will be able to tap into some of these issues, and between them, these sources. So what's happening in Scotland, Chris?
We're in the field right now.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, we're waiting for data to come back. That's with the Scottish election study. So,
So basically you need surveys conducted after the election, so you can see how people vote, which again, the YouGov and the Ashcroft surveys are in a sense the first instant features off, but it takes a while to distinguish between various possible hypotheses as to what's going on.
Thank you. So this gentleman, yeah, let's just straight across there.
In the context of what Boris did when he was trying to get Brexit done and purging the party, etc., of a lot of the people in the left within Parliament, where did the Conservative voters who leaned in that side go this time around?
Oh, look, people who supported reform, supported Remain, disappeared from the Conservative Party back in 2019. Right? It's very clear. So both in 2017 and in 2019, support for the Conservative Party fell amongst those who wanted to be inside the EU, and it increased amongst those who wanted to leave. And it became a very, very heavily pro-leave vote. They haven't lost that many, particularly large proportions of Remain voters since, not least because there aren't that many of them left. And in a sense, if you voted Remain in 2016, you still believed in Remain in 2019, and you were willing to vote for Boris Johnson, you basically, you were going to vote Tory, whatever they put up in whatever circumstances. Now, in the end, the Tory vote did go down amongst Remain voters, but as I've shown you on some of the graphs, it's overwhelmingly gone down amongst Leave voters. But basically, the Tories lost the Remain vote in 2017 and 2019.
Right. Sorry. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, sorry.
John, thanks very much for a really interesting talk. Could I ask you to say something about the influence of local deprivation? On some measures, the UK is the most unequal, socioeconomically unequal country in Western Europe. And after 2019, one policy that Boris Johnson particularly associated with was levelling up northern Midland towns, coastal towns that have suffered. Has the progress made in levelling up, or lack of it, been reflected at all in the electoral outcomes? I mean, there's Teesside, of course, with Ben Houchen and effects and so on, but more generally,
Yeah.
Can you say anything more about the
The
influence?
short answer to is not something I particularly looked at. My suspicion is, given the extent of the decline of the Leave vote, of the Conservative vote in Leave voting areas, that I suspect that those areas probably left the Conservative Party in particularly large numbers, but that's as much as I could tell you at the moment.
Right, we have 1, 2, and then we'll come down.
You showed that Labour's vote share nationally didn't really increase, but is there evidence of them purposefully spreading that vote to play to the electoral system, or is it more just the story of the Tories' losses?
Well, it's both. So it's certainly true that the Labour Party focused its efforts on constituencies where they were second. And the Democrats focused their efforts on where they were second. And the Labour Party was certainly wanting to improve the efficiency of its vote. And it did so, though in part as a result of losing a barrel load of votes in some very hitherto safe constituencies, and unfortunately in a few cases actually losing them. That is in combination with the way in which the Conservative vote falls, and the way in which the Conservative vote falls is primarily, it's much more to do with Reform than it is to do with Labour, right? Basically, if I'd also shown you the change in Reform vote by the Conservative vote last time, you will see also that the Reform vote goes up more in places where there were more Conservative voters last time. And so that's why I'm saying earlier, it's Reform that erode the foundations, and then Labour's greater efficiency, or particularly their focus on the seats they were trying to gain, then reaps the reward. But that's the way around I think you need to think about it. So it is both, but without the former, the latter would not have been as successful as it was.
Hello, John. The question's about voter ID.
Yeah.
Did you notice any significant difference in any patterns because of the introduction of voter ID? As previously, the point was there was no fraud and it was unnecessary. So is there any facts around the result of voter ID?
The short answer is there weren't any facts. And even when there are facts, they will be disputed. The only facts that we have is that in the 2023 English local elections, which is the only ones that the electoral commission has had time to analyse, 0.2% of the electorate turned up to a polling station, were refused a ballot paper because they didn't have ID, and then didn't come back again. Now, the significance of that figure is disputed because some returning officers, in order to be helpful, posted outside polling stations saying, by the way, you got your ID with you? And if they didn't, they were then told, go back and get your ID. So therefore, was this an undercount? And then also those who were opposed to the idea also then claimed, well, of course, the problem is that people who knew they didn't have ID didn't even try to turn up in the first place, right? Now, what I think we can say with a fair degree of confidence, given that evidence, even if you want to dispute the 0.2% figure, is it's not going to account for an 8% fall in turnout, okay? More broadly, the debate is now over because the Labour Party has now accepted voter ID. What its manifesto says is that it's now going to widen the range of forms of identification that will be accepted, and in particular, the obvious apparent discrepancy in terms of which bus passes were not acceptable, that will be removed. But basically, the Labour Party accepts that having made the change, it would be very, very difficult to go back and to, as it were, even if you accept that there wasn't much fraud, but to actually go back to a position where fraud would be more likely to happen than would otherwise be the case is basically difficult. And there's a broader international, I mean, the problem, I mean, I don't want to defend ID cards at all, but the problem we have is that we don't have ID cards. If we had ID cards, there wouldn't be an issue because we would know what everybody would be carrying. And by international standards, our previous rules were lax. Most countries and the OECD regard it as a benchmark of good electoral administration, that when voters turn up to a polling station, they are obliged to prove their identity. More broadly, I think there is now a feeling amongst the parties that, well, you know what? Younger people are used to having to prove their identity. They're having to do it all the time. Whereas an older person who has become less mobile, they no longer bother to renew their passport. They no longer bother to renew their driving license, and they may no longer even be able to use their bus pass. So it's not entirely clear that the age consequences, even with the apparently somewhat odd decisions about what passes were not acceptable, that they were necessarily going to work out in the way that perhaps some people originally anticipated on both sides of the argument.
I'd just like to say congratulations to you for kind of getting it pretty much spot on
Thank you very
beforehand.
much.
On,
work.
on the topic of international standards, have you had any phone calls from colleagues in France asking for help?
No, though, funnily enough, I did this morning, some of you may know, I do a podcast with Rachel Wolf called Trendy. And there is a new episode just out about the French elections. Not that either Rachel nor I know much about French politics, or at least what I know is about 30 years old, but we got in a good French expert. Answer to you, no. I mean, all I will say is, as compared with our even now fractured system, French party politics are an awful lot more complicated than ours. So, you know, good luck to them.
Right. We are unfortunately out of time. I know there are quite a few other questions, both online and in the room. I'm sorry, but John does give us his time freely, so we can only press upon him so much. But can I say that, you know, it is one thing about these lectures that you realize that the snippets that you hear on Radio 4 and on the telly don't do justice to the level of analysis that John regularly undertakes. And he just plugged his podcast, but I was also intending on plugging his podcast. So I'll go ahead and do it.
He's on next week.
It just so happens that, but nonetheless, whether or not I'm on the podcast, I do encourage you to give it a listen, because you do get the sort of extended John Curtice take on things with Rachel Wolf together. So thank you ever so much, Sir John, for your time and for your continued support, and for being so willing to engage with everyone on these topics.
My pleasure.
So thank you. Thank you, everyone. We will be announcing lectures for next academic year when we get them organized. So we'll be sending out communications about that. We do.
All right. We're good, it means.